The wine glass hit the floor before anyone understood what had happened. 6 people at that table. 6 sets of eyes. And one sound that mattered, the crack of a palm against skin, echoing off the marble like a gunshot in a church. Danielle Ross didn't cry out. She didn't even flinch. She turned her face back, slow, deliberate, and looked at the woman who'd struck her like she was studying a stranger's handwriting, trying to make out what it said. Nobody at that table knew yet that the woman who'd just been slapped owned 41% of the company whose name was stitched into the napkins. Nobody knew that by morning, the man at the head of that table, the billionaire, the founder, the one everyone in that room had built careers around pleasing, would have nothing left to found anything with. It started, like most disasters do, with somebody underestimating a quiet woman. Stay with me. Because before we get to that dinner, you need to understand who Danielle Ross really was and what it cost her to sit still. Danielle kept her calendar the way other people kept a rosary, counted, returned to for comfort. 6:15, she rose. 6:40, she ran 3 miles along the river path behind the house in Charlevoix, same route regardless of weather, because repetition was the point, not scenery. Nobody watching her would have guessed she was married to one of the wealthiest men in the Midwest. She wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation, drove herself everywhere, and still clipped coupons out of habit, even though the registered girl at the Charlevoix Kroger had stopped needing to see them years ago. She'd learned that habit the hard way. Twice. The first time was Terrence, back in Detroit, when she was 26 and thought a man who talked about his vision for 11 months was a man with a plan instead of a man with an audience. She covered his rent for a year. Co-signed a car. When she finally asked what his plan actually was, he told her she didn't understand ambition. He was gone within the month, and gone with her television. The second time was worse, because she should have known better by then. Isaiah had been polished, good job, good church, a good handshake with her father. He courted her for 2 years, and it was only after the ring that she found the second phone. The second woman. He didn't even deny it with any real energy. He just said, "You always saw what you wanted to see, Danielle," like her hurt was a character flaw. She told herself after Isaiah that she was done being a resource. Done being useful to men who mistook devotion for foolishness. She built walls so clean and so quiet that most people never even registered they were walls, they just felt, vaguely, that Danielle Ross was hard to get close to, and left it at that. By the time she met Marcus, she'd stopped expecting men to be anything other than eventually disappointing. She just hadn't expected to fall for one anyway. These days, in the house with the wraparound porch and more bedrooms than she could justify needing, Danielle's isolation didn't look like loneliness from the outside. It looked like independence. She had her mornings. Her runs. Her own small consulting practice she kept going, quietly, because some part of her never fully trusted that any of this, the house, the marriage, the money, was permanent enough to stop having her own name on something. She told herself that was just being smart. She never let herself finish the sentence about what she was being smart in case of. Marcus Webb grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Flint with his grandmother, his younger sister, and a leak in the roof that everybody just learned to put a bucket under instead of fixing, because fixing it meant money nobody had. He was 12 the first time he watched his grandmother count out exact change at the grocery store, slow, careful, lips moving, and he decided right then he was going to learn everything there was to learn about how money worked. He got a scholarship to Michigan State on the strength of a business plan he wrote for a 10th grade project, a delivery service for elderly folks who couldn't get to the pharmacy. His teacher told him it wasn't realistic. He built it anyway, at 19, out of his grandmother's garage, with a borrowed truck and a notebook full of names and needs. Marcus never forgot where that bucket had sat. Even after his name showed up in trade magazines, even after the second company made him rich, he kept habits that never changed. He tipped in cash, folded personally into the server's hand, because he remembered needing money today, not in a payroll cycle. He called his grandmother every Sunday at 7, no matter what continent he was on. And he never let anyone on his team speak down to the people who cleaned the offices, because he remembered what it felt like to be the help. He was careful in rooms full of money, not intimidated. He'd earned his seat, but careful, the way a man is careful in a house that isn't his. He noticed things other executives didn't, which assistant hadn't eaten lunch, which junior associate got interrupted in every meeting, which server had been on their feet 12 hours for tips people rarely left generously. That instinct, watching who got overlooked, was the same instinct that made him notice Danielle in the first place, 3 years before that dinner, in a hotel lobby in Chicago where a coffee order got mixed up. They met over a wrong latte. Marcus had ordered oat milk, the barista handed him a cup of black coffee instead, and Danielle, standing 2 feet away, had already reached for the correct cup, the oat milk one, assuming it was hers. "That one's actually mine," Marcus said, not unkindly, holding up the black coffee like evidence. Danielle looked at the cup, looked at him, and said, "Well, now we've got a mystery. Somebody in this lobby is drinking the wrong thing and doesn't even know it." He laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and they traded cups and stood there another 10 minutes talking about nothing important. He mentioned he was in town for a supplier meeting. She mentioned she consulted for 2 companies in that same building, though she didn't say which, and he didn't press. What actually caught him wasn't her looks, though she was striking. It was that when the flustered barista over-apologized, Danielle touched the young woman's arm and said, "You're doing great. Nobody even noticed but us." Marcus watched her do that and felt something shift in his chest. They exchanged numbers on a coffee sleeve, then nothing, for 3 weeks. But something in him kept circling back to that sleeve, folded in his wallet, and he texted her on a Tuesday for no reason except that he wanted to know if she was still drinking the wrong coffee on purpose. For 2 months, it stayed easy. Small text exchanges. A coffee here, a walk there. Marcus never mentioned what he did beyond "I run a logistics company," technically true in the understatement of the decade. He liked, more than he expected, being just a man to her, somebody who showed up on time, remembered she didn't like cilantro, texted back within the hour instead of vanishing for days. Danielle noticed things too. He never once tried to impress her, no name-dropping, no performance. He drove a truck that had seen better decades and wore the same navy coat until she teased him about it, laughing that it still had years left in it. She noticed he asked about her work like he actually wanted to understand it, not like he was waiting his turn to talk. He remembered small things, her sister's name, that she hated when people chewed with their mouths open, the anniversary of her mother's passing, mentioned only once, months earlier. Slowly, without meaning to, she started letting her guard down in small, deniable ways. She let him pick the restaurant once instead of always choosing somewhere she controlled. She told him about Terrence, in pieces, watching his face for the flicker of judgment she expected and never quite got. She let herself, one evening on his porch, put her head on his shoulder for exactly as long as felt safe, then a little longer than that. "Here's a question for you, and I really do want to know, have you ever caught yourself testing someone, even without meaning to, just to see if they'd fail the way somebody else once did? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and honestly, some of your stories are the reason I keep writing these." It was a bank statement that did it. From the joint account they'd set up 6 months into the engagement, back when everything still felt uncomplicated. She was reconciling numbers one night when she noticed a transfer she didn't recognize, $40,000, out, to an account she'd never heard of. Her stomach dropped the exact way it had the night she found Isaiah's second phone. She didn't ask him about it right away. That was the old pattern reasserting itself: watch first, gather evidence, don't give him time to build a story. She started noticing things she'd have brushed off a month earlier. Late nights that used to just be late nights. A closed laptop screen. A phone call he stepped outside to take. None of it was new behavior. It was the same Marcus. But her eyes had changed, and everything looked different through them, the way a familiar room looks sinister at 3 a.m. with the lights off. She lay awake beside him, listening to him breathe, and thought, I built a whole life around trusting the wrong men before. I am not doing it again with my eyes closed. Danielle didn't confront him. She tested him instead, quietly, the way she'd learned to do everything, without raising her voice or tipping her hand. She told Marcus, on a Thursday, that she needed to fly out to Atlanta for 2 days for a difficult client, an old lie she hadn't used since her 20s. What she actually did was check into a motel 11 miles from their house, under her maiden name, and wait. She'd planted something small before she left, her late mother's bracelet, tucked visibly into the drawer of the front hall table where staff dropped mail and packages. Not hidden. Just left, the way something gets left by accident. She wanted to see, without any performance in the room, who Marcus actually was when he thought no one who mattered was watching. The first night, nothing happened that she could see, because nothing was meant to. She drove past the house twice in a rental car, feeling foolish and sick with herself in equal measure, telling herself this was smart. This was not the same as what her mother used to do to her father, hiring people to follow him, turning love into surveillance until there was nothing left to love. On the second evening, she watched from 2 houses down as Marcus's new assistant, a young woman named Priya who'd started only a month earlier, arrived at the house to drop off documents he'd need for a morning call. Danielle watched the porch light. Watched the door open. Watched Priya step inside for what should have been 30 seconds. She was inside for 11 minutes. Danielle's hands were steady on the wheel, but her heart wasn't. When Priya finally came back out, she was tucking something into her bag, small, catching the porch light for just a second. The bracelet. Every old wound in Danielle's chest opened at once. Not because of what she'd seen exactly, she hadn't seen anything decisive, not really, just a woman leaving a house with something in her bag, but because her whole body had already written the story before her mind caught up, the way it always had, the way it had with Terrence and with Isaiah, because some part of her had never stopped expecting this exact ending. She didn't confront anyone. She drove back to the motel, sat on the edge of the bed, and didn't cry, because crying felt like it would confirm something she wasn't ready to confirm. She just sat very still, the way she had at that dinner table months later, the way stillness had always been her armor. For 3 days after she came back from her trip, Danielle was a wall. She answered Marcus's questions in single words. She stopped reaching for his hand across the console in the car, a small habit she hadn't realized she'd built until she took it away. She started sleeping in the guest room, blaming a cold that never quite materialized. Marcus knew something had shifted, but every time he asked, she deflected, "I'm just tired, it's work, I'm fine," in a tone so flat it was its own kind of answer. He tried everything he knew. He brought home the soup from the place she liked. He didn't push. He gave her room, even as the distance between them widened in a way that frightened him more than he let on. On the 4th day, Danielle finally asked him, with the practiced calm of a woman defusing something she expected to explode, whether he'd seen her mother's bracelet anywhere. She watched his face when she asked. Watched for the flicker. He frowned, genuinely puzzled, and said he hadn't, and would she like him to have the house checked, maybe it fell behind a drawer. That was the moment she almost told him everything. Almost. But something old and scarred in her closed back over, and instead she just said, "It's fine. It'll turn up," and went back to her silence, more certain now than ever that something was being hidden from her, that his confusion was simply a better performance than Isaiah's had ever been. It was Priya who finally broke the standoff, entirely by accident. She came by on a Sunday afternoon, apologetic, holding out a small velvet pouch. "I meant to give this back sooner," she said. "I found it in the hallway when I dropped off Mr. Webb's documents, and didn't want to leave something valuable sitting out with the packages, so I took it home to keep safe. I'm sorry it took this long, I've had my grandmother in the hospital and it slipped my mind." Danielle stood in her own doorway holding her mother's bracelet, and felt the entire structure of her suspicion collapse in on itself at once, silent and total, like a building coming down with no sound because the demolition had happened deep in the foundation, out of sight. Her hands didn't shake, exactly. They just went very still, the stillness of someone holding something they suddenly understand they could have shattered. She thanked Priya, closed the door, and stood in the hallway a long time, breathing slowly, doing the math on her own suspicion and coming up, finally, honest. She had built an entire narrative of betrayal out of a young woman's basic decency. She had spent 3 days punishing a man for a sin that had never happened, based on evidence she'd manufactured herself and then misread on purpose, because misreading it fit a story she already knew by heart. She thought about Marcus's face when she'd asked about the bracelet, not guilty, just confused, worried for her. 11 minutes that had felt so damning were, in fact, just a kind young woman being careful with someone else's jewelry. Danielle sat down on the bottom stair, the bracelet in her palm, and finally let herself cry not for the bracelet, and not even really for Marcus, but for every year she'd spent so certain that safety required suspicion, that love without surveillance was just love waiting to happen to her. She found him in the garage that evening, working on nothing in particular, the way he did when his hands needed something to do while his mind worked through a problem he couldn't name. She stood in the doorway a moment before she spoke, and when she finally did, her voice didn't have its usual careful edges. "I have to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything." He set down the wrench. Gave her his full attention, the way he always did, which she'd never let herself fully appreciate until right then. She told him everything, the bank statement, the false trip, the motel, watching the house, the bracelet, Priya, in a voice that got smaller the longer she talked, until by the end she wasn't looking at him at all, just at her own hands. "I tested you," she said. "I made you a suspect in my own mind before you ever did a single thing wrong. And I know why I did it, I know exactly why. I could write you an essay on why, but knowing why doesn't make it okay. I did that to you." Marcus was quiet long enough that she made herself look up. "You know what the hardest part of being with someone like you is," he said finally, and his voice wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. "It's not the money, or people assuming things about me. It's knowing that no matter how consistent I am, some part of you is always waiting for the day I stop. I've felt that from the beginning. I just didn't know how deep it went until right now." "I know," she said. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm not the man who hurt you," he said. "But I understand now why you keep expecting me to turn into them. I just need you to understand what it costs me, being measured against ghosts I never met." "I do understand," she said. "And I don't want to keep running background checks on your character every time I get scared." He crossed the garage and took her face in his hands, the bracelet still in her fist between them. "Then don't," he said. "Just tell me next time. Ask me. I'd rather answer a hard question 100 times than find out you were hiding in a motel 11 miles away, watching my porch light." It wasn't fixed in that conversation, but something real happened there, in the garage, with grease on his hands and her mother's bracelet between them. They chose, both of them, to keep going anyway. Marcus's mother, Loretta, had never fully warmed to Danielle, not because she disliked her, but because she'd watched her son build everything from nothing, and was suspicious, on principle, of anyone who arrived after the empire was already standing. 2 weeks after the garage conversation, Loretta came to Sunday dinner and asked Marcus, in front of everyone, why a man of his accomplishment would marry a woman who didn't trust him enough to ask a simple question before turning herself into her own private investigator. The table went quiet. Danielle felt her face go hot. Marcus set down his fork, unhurried, and answered his mother directly, without defensiveness. "Because trust isn't something people just have, Mama. It's something people build, especially when life's taught them not to. Danielle's been let down by men who looked good on paper and turned out rotten underneath. I'd rather spend my life proving I'm not one of them than marry somebody who's never been hurt enough to be careful." Loretta studied her son, then studied Danielle, who hadn't looked away, hadn't hidden behind her napkin the way she might have a year earlier. "Well," Loretta finally said, "at least he's not lying to himself about what he signed up for." It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was the closest thing to acceptance Danielle had ever gotten from her. A month later, over coffee on the porch, Danielle told Marcus something she hadn't quite said outright in the garage. "The trip to Atlanta," she said. "It wasn't really about the bracelet. It was a test. I wanted to see who you were when you thought no one who mattered was watching." Marcus turned his cup in his hands. "I figured that out eventually," he said. "The dates didn't add up. No client emergency runs exactly the same week I get a new assistant." "I'm not sorry I needed to know," Danielle said. "I'm only sorry about how I went about it. I could have just asked you who you were when the room emptied. I already knew the answer, deep down. I think I just needed my eyes to catch up to what my heart already believed." He reached over and covered her hand with his. "The bracelet. Your mother's. Maybe it ought to mean something different now. Not the thing that almost broke us. The thing that proved we didn't break." She looked down at it, worn every day since Priya returned it. Maybe it's not about what almost happened, she said. Maybe it's just about what actually did. The old bracelet's clasp had been loose for years, her mother's, and her grandmother's before that, never properly repaired, just reinforced with whatever held at the time. Marcus, it turned out, had spent 2 weekends teaching himself basic jewelry repair from online videos, quietly, determined to fix it properly instead of letting it hang by a thread. They ended up doing it together on the back porch over several slow evenings, Marcus with a jeweler's loupe and Danielle guiding him through what she remembered of her mother wearing it. It took patience neither of them had needed to practice with each other before, careful work, undone and redone when they got the tension wrong. There was laughter in it too. Marcus dropped a tiny screw into the porch boards and they spent 20 minutes hunting for it with a flashlight, giggling like teenagers, and somewhere in that search, Danielle realized she hadn't laughed that easily with another person in years. By the third evening, the clasp held firm. Danielle wore the bracelet every day after that, and every time it caught the light, it seemed to say something neither of them needed to put into words anymore, that some things broken can be repaired, slowly, by hand, by people willing to kneel on the floor together looking for what was lost. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, nothing built up around it. They were doing dishes, an old ritual by then, him washing, her drying, the bracelet catching light off the kitchen window every time she reached for a glass. "You know I love you," Marcus said, not looking up from the sink, like it was the most natural sentence in the world to drop into soap suds. Danielle went still, dish towel in hand. "I know," she said. Then, because something in her had finally worn down enough to let it out plainly, "I love you too." I don't think I've said that out loud before. Not without some part of me bracing for it to be used against me later. Marcus turned off the water, dried his hands slowly, and just looked at her. "I know it costs you more to say than it costs most people," he said. "I don't take that lightly." "I know you don't," she said. "That's exactly why I could finally say it." They stood there a while longer, dishes forgotten, the bracelet warm against her wrist. The proposal, the real one, the one that mattered, happened back at the hotel in Chicago, same lobby, same coffee counter, 18 months after that first mixed-up order. Marcus had arranged it with the manager weeks in advance, and when Danielle walked in that afternoon expecting a simple work trip, the same young barista who'd once handed him the wrong cup was standing behind the counter again, grinning like she'd been let in on a secret, which she had. "Order for Danielle," the barista called out, sliding a cup across the counter. Oat milk, correctly this time, and taped to the side of it, instead of a napkin, was a small velvet pouch. Danielle looked at Marcus, standing a few feet away in the same navy coat, a little grayer at the temples now, watching her with an expression she'd come to recognize as the truest thing about him, steady, unguarded, entirely without performance. Inside the pouch wasn't a ring, not at first. It was a small tool, the jeweler's loupe he'd used to fix her mother's bracelet, engraved along the handle, still here, still working. "I figured," Marcus said, crossing the lobby toward her, "you'd trust a tool more than another speech from me. But since you're looking at me like you want the speech anyway, Danielle, I don't have anything left to prove to you. I think we already proved it, both of us, the hard way. I just want to keep proving it, every day, for however long you'll let me." The ring was in his pocket. He got down on one knee, right there by the coffee counter where they'd first traded cups, and this time there was no mix-up at all, just two people who'd finally learned to see each other clearly. Here's what I've come to believe, watching stories like Danielle and Marcus's unfold: fear makes excellent evidence and terrible truth. It will show you exactly what you're afraid of, every time, whether or not it's actually there. Real love isn't the absence of that fear, it's choosing, again and again, to ask the honest question instead of building the silent case. It's kneeling on a porch floor at night, hunting for a lost screw with someone, and realizing that's what trust actually looks like, not the absence of things breaking, but the willingness to fix them together, by hand, for as long as it takes. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. Tell me, have you ever tested someone you loved, the way Danielle did, just to protect yourself from being hurt again? And does that bracelet mean something different now than it did before all this happened? Drop your thoughts below. I read every comment, and they shape which stories I tell next. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because next week's story will not see coming a mother who finds out the son she raised alone isn't who she thinks he is, and a letter that changes everything. I'll see you there.